Welcome to Spectrum Perspectives, real talk with parents, professionals, and autism advocates, with your host, Cindy Gellermini.
Hi, everyone. This is Cindy, and welcome to another episode of Spectrum Perspectives. And today we have Honey Rinicella with us. Hi, Honey.
Hello.
Thank you for being here today.
I'm so excited to be here.
So we have a lot of stuff to talk about today. So I want to just get right to it, and then we can get to where we are today. So you have twin boys that are on the spectrum, correct?
Yep.
And how old are they now?
Yep, they're 23. They're identical twins. They are incredible humans. I absolutely adore them both, but I couldn't tell anybody that nobody could tell that they were identical by personality because they are completely different. It's the one thing I always try to stress about my twins is their autism, their diagnoses, their medical conditions, everything about them is completely different. Their personalities, everything.
Interesting. You are, I think, my first twin mom that I've had on the show. I've had siblings and stuff, but I haven't talked to anybody who had twins. So I have twins, but Robbie's the one that had the autism. So you're my first autism twin mom. So let's go back to the beginning when you were pregnant, because I had twins as well. So it's considered a high risk pregnancy. Sometimes they do a little extra tests, some extra sonograms and things like that. Were there any red flags when you were pregnant? Did doctors say anything?
I had a daughter 21 months prior, so I'd already had a child and kind of knew what pregnancy was and kind of knew what to expect. And so I knew something was wrong with, I thought something was wrong with me, that I was either birthing aliens or I was having a miscarriage, because at like 8 weeks, I was like vomiting nonstop. I was really, really sick. And so I went into the doctor and they had said that I wasn't miscarrying and I definitely wasn't having aliens, but they were like, there's two. And so there were 2 sacs and 2 placentas, which I think I got really, really sick. If I had to guess, it was just because everything was splitting and moving. And it's really early to have 2 sacs and 2 placentas, because the reason I share that is because after they were born, we found out we had to do testing, because typically that's a sign of fraternals, and mine were identical. So they split really, really early, which I think is what tripped me up a little bit. So that was my only real issue in pregnancy, was the sickness, that I was very, very sick. And they told me that 2 boys, being a female and having just had a child 21 months prior, was probably a lot to do with the sickness, because my body was probably just a little depleted and they were pulling everything from me. So the only complication I actually had was that my one son, which was baby A, which was my son Victor, was low fluid. So I went on bed rest, and, we did the ultrasounds a couple times a week, the 3D ultrasounds, to make sure that his fluid was stable and everything was okay. And then, they thought they were going to come at 31 weeks, but I actually made it to 36. And so they were born 5'15", 6'2", incredibly healthy. They had a little bit of a weak APGAR. They were like a 7, but were totally fine within their second round. And they had a weak suck swallow. But aside from that, I brought a NIC nurse home with me. They wanted to keep them just a couple days to see that they could, swallow a little bit stronger. And I was like, I'd rather bring them home with me. Pretty versed with nursing. I got this whole thing down pat. I got this. And so I brought one of the nurses with me just to make sure everything was on par. And they were great. And they took off and they bounced back. And fortunately, my breast milk was like whey protein. So they chunked right up within like a week or 2, and we hit the ground running, and they were like absolutely perfect and amazing.
Okay. And then, so let's move forward. Was their development on time, on schedule?
Yeah, everything was developing on time. I do have to share, I have to be completely truthful because this is my story, but I was a stay-at-home mom, 3 kids. My husband traveled. So one of my friends who was a preschool teacher helped me as like my nanny, I guess you could say. She was more like a big sister. And we're like, every time we take them to the doctor for a well visit, they come home really, really sick. So they were okay. But every time I would take them into the doctor, I was like, how are they getting sick? They must be picking something up there, because they would instantly, we started dealing with croup, and then we started seeing some eczema, and all these things started popping up, which was really bizarre to me, because my daughter was totally healthy and I never had any of these issues, and I couldn't understand. And I did know that twins, boys, preemies were like a weaker sex, and that they were more, I guess, prone to having issues. So when I finally went into my 15-month visit, I was getting ready to go on a trip and leave them for the first time. So I was weaning them off of breastfeeding so I could go on this trip. I kept throwing away club trips for my husband. And I was like, all right, I'll bring my daughter. I'll leave my twins here with my friends and my like family. And when I took them to that visit, everything like changed. So, I have a federal court of claims lawsuit as a result of that visit. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
they completely regressed after that well visit and their inoculations. So my whole world, I went on my trip. I thought something was wrong, and it's kind of a funny story. My husband thinks it's funny. It's just ironic, but I was like, something's really wrong now. Something's really wrong after that visit. And we were this is what's kind of funny. So we were in the Bahamas. We were at Atlantis with my daughter and a babysitter. And my husband was like, they'll be fine. It's just a week. And I'm like, okay. I was sneaking into the bathroom when everybody fell asleep. Our phone bill was like thousands of dollars. And I was calling every night to my house going, I didn't realize it was so expensive. I think I was like, pregnancy brain and newborn mama. Like I was calling them nonstop. Like, something's wrong. Something is really wrong. They cried nonstop when I got home. And then they were really lethargic and like constantly lethargic. So, we had one significant reaction that we documented. My one son turned blue, and we were told that had we put him to sleep, he would have passed from SIDS. And it kind of made me realize something's really wrong here. And my doctor actually sent us to Emory University and was like, I think you had a reaction. I think you need to figure out what happened. And so we went there, and that's where they were like, oh my gosh, you need a lawyer, you need to figure out what happened. And I was like, okay, that's okay. We know what happened now. How do I fix it? Like, what do I do? How can I fix this? How can I heal them? Like, I know I did something bad or I allowed something bad to happen. Now, what do I do? So, when they did, I will say this, they were developing totally fine. And then after that visit, I went back for my next one 3 months later, and they were like a year delayed. Like everything that they were doing, the pincher graphs, they were pulling to standing. I have videos of them holding hands going, saying mama and dada. And, they weren't like the highest on the scale of being able to do anything, but they weren't the lowest by any means. So, when I went back and they were like a year delayed, and they lost their pincher graphs, they lost the eye tracking, it's the same story so many of us have that, they appeared deaf. We would clang pots and they didn't even recognize that we were in the room. And, the whole world was like, what just happened? And for me, it was like a light switch. It was a black and white change for me. Like I went in to this appointment, my kids were not well. I went away for a week. I came back, and it was just never the same since. It was just never the same since.
Wow.
So, fast forward 21 months old, they were diagnosed from Emory. They actually were diagnosed with Mercury Induced Autism. I don't know if that's okay to say on
Didn't
here.
know that there was such a thing. Okay.
Yeah, neither did I.
Okay.
Neither did I. But the EPA safe limit for thimerosal was 0.05, and my kids were given like 125.5 mcgs by the time they were 15 months of age. So I was like, where did they even get all this? But of course they had suggested I bring my, my inoculation charts and all my well visit charts. And then when the lawyer started putting everything together, and they were like, oh my gosh, how could you not, this is the sad part. As a mom, they were like, how could you not have recognized that every time you brought them in, when you brought them home, after having that was a reaction, they were sick. And I'm like, I kept asking my doctor, it was all documented. Mom called, complained, child is screaming nonstop, 103 fever, like came in for a visit, got on antibiotics, ear infection, antibiotics didn't work, new ear infections, like more antibiotics. It was just like, the lawyers almost looked at me like, how did you not recognize this pattern, that this was a reaction? Because you kept bringing them in, they kept having reactions. And
Because
I'm like,
you keep trusting the doctor. That's
right.
why.
And I'm like, because I'm a mom. I'm like, I was not a doctor. I
Right.
am actually a hippie mom. And I should add, I grew up on an organic goat farm in Vermont. So I'm a little more like open-minded, and I'm aware, but nobody ever told me that there was a correlation to when I came home and they got sick. the doctors kept saying they probably are picking up a bug. Or, maybe your daughter touched something at the daycare, or I mean, not daycare, at the park, because we didn't even have a daycare. I'm like, I'm a stay-at-home mom, breastfeeding my kids, making all my own organic baby food. It just doesn't seem right. And they were like, they're, twins, boys, preemies, their immune system's a little weaker.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my story in a nutshell. And at 21 months, they were diagnosed with the autism. Yeah.
And where did you go that they said the Mercury autism?
Emory University. I was living in Atlanta at the time. My twins were born in Atlanta.
Okay.
And so we were at Northside Hospital. And ironically, I had a midwife, but since they were twins, boys, preemies, I'm sure you know this, they I had it in a hospital because I had to have like a backup just in case there was something wrong with them, because we didn't really know what to expect since my one son had the low fluid. But they were fine, and we didn't end up needing any of the units or anything. So yeah, so I hit the ground running with, okay, what do I need to do to fix this? What's
Right.
going on here? How do I fix this? And then I have to tell you, this is crazy because my daughter's currently getting her doctorate of OT, and somebody that had entered my house, I feel like truly saved me, because it was an OT and she saw my son fall. And when he fell, it was my son, Vincent, and he had cut his lip open and he was bleeding. And my husband's Sicilian, and literally he could walk in and like his arm could be bleeding. And I'd be like, oh, you got a cut. What'd you do? And he's like, I don't know. So my son fell in front of her, cut his lip open. And I looked at her and I said, oh, he's got my husband's tough Italian genes. And she looked at me, and she wasn't really personable or friendly, but she was very factual. And she looked at me and said, no, honey, that's an opioid effect from gluten. You need to get him off of gluten. And I'm like, gluten? And I have to tell you, so my kids were born in 2000. So this was like 2002. I go, what the hell is gluten? Like, I didn't even know. I had no idea everybody now knows because it's like trendy to be gluten-free. But back in that day, I had no idea. So it was kind of funny because I was like, gluten, like, why would that have? So I hit the ground running, started researching gluten. She gave me the name of this Dan doctor. His name was Dr. John Hicks. He was coming to Atlanta every now and then. And so I made an appointment, said, can you see them? And it was just crazy. The whole thing was just crazy. So I hit the ground running, figuring out how to do the gluten-free diet. I mean, at that time there's Chick-fil-A on every corner because I lived in Atlanta. I was literally eating off the breadcrumbs of like the Chick-fil-A nuggets because I'm like, they can eat the meat. Because if I give them like a special treat, I was like, yeah, no, that's not how it's done. They didn't make grills back in the day. But so it took me probably like 6 months to figure out how to really do the diet, like how to really figure it out and make sure I didn't have cross-contamination. I was doing it right. And by the grace of God, it was really game-changing for my kids. Really, it was probably the biggest intervention I'd ever done. Yeah, my one son, Victor, when they had their regression, my one son, Vincent, they're just this beautiful, quiet, thoughtful humanitarian. He kind of just went in his own world. And he was the one that was like, it was like he wasn't even there. It was just like a shell. And it was really sad. But my son, Victor, became like an exposed nerve. I mean, like you would get ice out of the ice machine and it was like you're ripping his limbs out. He felt like, I mean, everything.
From the sound?
Yep. He was so sound sensitive, touch sensitive, like everything. The only thing that comforted him was us holding him. And I credit that to a lot of the breastfeeding because, I was like holding him all the time. And that became like his one place of comfort. So that's where I said right at the beginning, I'm like, my twins couldn't be more different. I mean, they're so different. Their personalities are different. The way they handled everything was different. The way they were affected by their injury was different. Everything has been different, completely different for both of them. And, when we took Victor off of the gluten and the dairy, I think the dairy was actually equally, if not more important. It ended up like calming him down like a ton. Like nothing was as severe. His exaggerated reactions to everything lessened. And so it helped his language started coming back. He stopped screaming all the time. It was a really huge, big win for us, like the gluten dairy free diet. And I was already, organic and healthy, making my own baby food from scratch to start. I married a Sicilian man. He married me because I could cook. So I loved making all their food and that was already there, but I just had to figure out how to now make it without gluten and dairy.
Yeah,
And what's
but then
really
to tell them that they can't, an Italian, that they can't have pasta, that's not gonna
oh,
fly.
I know. Thank God Jovial pasta came out it's from Italy.
Mhm.
Tigliata, I think might have been from Italy as well, but it came out once I had to say, I'm like, look, they make it there. So
Mhm.
he was okay. Plus in Italy, they actually test kids by the age of 5 to ensure they don't have celiac. So
Oh,
it's
really?
something that like I'm like, why would we not do that? Because what's an interesting fact along this journey, what I found out with my boys is that I was researching all this stuff back in the day, and 20 years ago, like I just mentioned, none of this was out there. It was all relevant to celiac disease. So, anything you typed about gluten-free, it was all about celiac disease. Well, I have to tell you the craziest story. All of that happened with my sons really saved my daughter, because when I was Googling it all, I was like, oh my
Mhm.
gosh, bags under the eyes, like
Right.
irritable tummy, like whiny after they eat, like not sleeping, small stature. My daughter was very petite, all this stuff. I'm like, I think she might have celiac disease. So I got my daughter tested. She has celiac. So
Huh.
I was like, oh my gosh. So took her off of gluten, and hers was like a miraculous recovery too, because she was like, Mom, I didn't realize my tummy wasn't supposed to hurt. Like she
Oh.
was in chronic pain. And I think about that all the time, because how many of our kids with autism can't say that? Or even know that. Like my
Right.
daughter, who was totally typical at 5 years of age when I took her off gluten, recognized that she was in chronic pain and she didn't know she wasn't supposed to be. And she didn't know how to tell me. So
Mhm.
it's something that I'm so passionate about, the medical treatment of our kids with autism, because I mean, she was like the most powerful message to me of how relevant that was.
Right. Right. Hmm.
Yeah. So
Okay, so did they went to school? Did they go to a regular school? Did they go to school for autistic kids? What?
So when we hit the ground running when they were 2, so from 2 to 3, we spent a year doing all these in-home therapies, 40 hours a week,
Wow.
like really intense. Um, and I realized really quickly, I lived in Atlanta. I realized the South was not going to be a friend to my needs for my kids.
Mhm.
And my husband's company was based out of Pennsylvania. I'm from Vermont. My husband's from Cleveland. And the company was like, if you ever want to move, we'll move you up here. It would make it easier on us for you, if you were here in the same state, and we wouldn't have to fly you back and forth for meetings. And I started realizing there wasn't a lot that could help my kid in Atlanta. So I actually ended up talking to my husband, and we ended up moving to Pennsylvania. So I live outside of Philly in a town called Westchester. And when I moved there, I instantly placed them in a preschool environment that was for special needs kids. Victor went to a higher functioning autism, you know, classroom, I guess you could say, where the needs weren't as intense. But then Vincent, because he was completely nonverbal still in his own world, but waking up a little bit in ours when we changed the diet. But the non-speaking part
Mhm.
was what made everybody think he was so severe. So
Right.
they put him in this like really severe autistic support classroom.
Right.
So that was
Right.
right at 3 years of age. They went right in there.
And I'm sure they used ABA.
Oh yeah, yeah. We actually did something called PRT, pivotal response training. So
Mhm.
it's kind of like a kind of like a little bit of ABA. My one to Victor, we stuck more to the floor time. We figured out really quickly that he needed more of the like nurturing, loving touch, because he was that exposed nerve. He
Right.
needed, whereas Vincent, to get the engagement, we needed more of the ABA. So for Vincent, it was almost like putting a puzzle for him. Like it was just something to get him to do to stay engaged. Whereas Victor, we needed to be like, it's okay, we're right here with you. Let's
Mhm.
do this puzzle together. So it was
Right.
we did the PRT, pivotal response training. Definitely Victor, more floor time. Definitely Vincent, my non-speaker, more ABA.
Mhm. So I guess they stayed there till they were 21, right? They're
Well,
23 now, or did you switch them around?
oh yeah, I switched them everywhere. After she changed, I
But we
put them.
want to get to we want to get to, RPM, S2C, all that
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
stuff. So
yeah. And I'll tell you, so
yeah.
what's important for that. So
Mhm.
when they went in this amazing private school. They were both in this amazing private school called the Vanguard School. I loved it. And they were both there. They were like, we'd love to keep Victor, but we can't maintain Vincent's needs because he's non-speaking. And I was like, well, where do I go? So I put him back in my public school, and I stayed there until they were in going into middle school. Middle school, I put Victor back in that school. That was great for him. It was more for like high functioning kids. And then Vincent, I put in actually a school called the Talk Institute.
Hmm.
which Soma is on the board of, and it's a school
Ah,
for apraxia,
okay.
and my district
Yes.
paid for it.
Yeah,
And
so explain apraxia, because we throw these words out all the time and not all my listeners know what all these words mean. So
yeah,
explain
so
apraxia.
apraxia is really in essence, it's really just a brain body disconnect. It's when your brain is telling your body to do something and your body can't do it. So like it's for what they taught me right off the bat was Vincent's brain is okay. He just can't get his mouth to say what he's thinking. And
Right.
that was pretty much they were like, that's what apraxia is.
Right,
So it's really the inability to communicate your thoughts through your mouth.
right.
For
Okay.
So that's where he went to school. He went to school at this amazing school. They presumed intellect. They believed in my son way before I did. They were like, "Oh, yeah, he's in there," and I'm like,
Mhm.
"Like he's really sweet," like
Mhm.
But they were great. It was an amazing school. It was a wonderful, wonderful school.
And this is in Pennsylvania, this school?
Yep, yep, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And so Soma was on the board. All right. And they presumed competence. So that's all RPM speak. So they
Mhm.
started, so he was middle school age. So is that so they used RPM with him?
So they were trained in RPM. So they had that mindset. So they had the RPM mindset. So the staff
Okay.
was a lot of the staff was trained in RPM. And the reason the school existed was because when Soma started with RPM, rapid prompted method, the founder of the school that Vincent went to packed up her son and moved out to California to learn how to do it. And so then she brought it to Pennsylvania to be like, oh my gosh, we have to help these kids. It's apraxia. And so that was actually a really wonderful thing because it exposed me right away to her. And
Mhm.
so I actually, when Vincent was younger, took him to go see Soma. And I was like, oh my gosh, she's like, it's like rubbing a lamp for a genie. What she can get out of him. I
Yeah.
was like, this is amazing. Like, I was like, wow, she's like this superhuman, like autism
Mhm.
whisperer. Like, it was
Mhm.
just crazy. So I knew that she knew what she was doing. And I had followed her journey. I had followed her son. I had, was so in awe. So when I had to, I fought to get my son into school because I knew it's where he needed to be if he needed to have a chance.
Right. This is interesting because there's people that are fighting their schools because their schools will not use these methods.
Mhm.
So, I'm happy to hear that there are some schools that do use it. So some people are going to want to know about that. I did interview Soma, so they can go back and watch that.
Yeah, no, they are not allowed to. The school will allow anything. The school is really good at allowing whatever modality they needed. So it
Mhm.
was really more so me
Which is how
finding
it should be.
Vincent. Right, correct,
Whatever
correct.
works for your kid, use it.
Right. So Vincent didn't go to that school for RPM.
Mhm.
But I needed him in that school for the mindset of the people that understood the RPM. So he didn't go to a school that offered it. That we should be really clear. But she was on the board, so she was always like, you have to presume intellect and you have to know that they're in there and you have to work to find a way to get them out. And so RPM was also very academic when it first started out as well. And that's part of one of the biggest differences. And I think that's where RPM it was initially created as like a teaching technique, right? And if you go on their website, it still describes RPM as an academic program. So she absolutely, Soma pioneered that concept of presuming competence in all of our kids. And they paved the way for all of this, other spelling modality to follow. So she was definitely on the forefront of all of that. I mean, so thankful for everything that she had done. But I could never replicate it. So I would see what she did. And again, I felt like she was like a genie being able to, like she could rub a magic lamp and get my kid out of him. Like I didn't know how she was doing. And I did everything that I could to try and get him to do that with me to no success.
So she actually worked with him.
Yes, Soma worked with him in the very beginning. And then where I lived and where I lived, there weren't, as you probably know, there aren't very many RPM providers. I don't know if she mentioned that, but anytime one of them would come, I had to drive like 2 hours to see her, to even have
Yeah.
Vincent see her.
Yeah.
And then anytime somebody would bring like a spelling center or some kind of an OT center would bring an RPM practitioner in, I was the first one to sign up to do lessons because I knew my
Right.
son. It was like the only time I could see that my son was actually in there. It was like a glimpse. Oh my gosh, he's in there.
Right.
So I went to every one of the top RPM practitioners, loved every one of them, hung on their every word, thought they were all like magical goddesses.
Mhm.
Literally. I mean, I'm so thankful for them. I will never forget one time, I believe it was Erica. She's a really well-known practitioner with Soma. And I walked in and I was like, hey, listen, we're supposed to do something at school for Grandparents' Day. And I have no idea what he thinks about his grandparents. Do you think you could ask him? And she was like, I go, we can cut out pictures and stuff and I can do it with him, but I'd really want to know his thoughts. And she was like, Vince, do you want to talk about that? And he had said, his sister had just come home from college and he said, I'd really rather write a letter to my sister
Oh.
in the middle. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I can't get him to do nothing with me. Like it was just crazy, but it was also mind blowing. And I remember that was like the first day I just sat there and cried because I'm like, he has so much to say.
Mhm.
How am I ever going to get it out?
Mhm.
Yeah, unless I follow all these genie rubbers everywhere, like these lamp rubbers, right?
Mhm.
These
Mhm.
magical people.
So you did eventually have a breakthrough with him,
I
right?
did. So what was crazy is that, so I was seeing, these RPM people and again, love them all. I think if you ask them, like they know I love them. I love them.
Mhm.
And for 20 years, I did parent support and I ran like the National Autism Conference and I would throw conferences and I made Soma my keynote one time. And I actually told everybody in the entire audience that Soma showed me that my son is in there. And I love their work. So I was always very thankful to what they were doing. But then fast forward, I was sitting, one of my organizations had a Facebook page, and I was sitting there checking all the messages that people were writing to us for Autism Awareness Month. And somebody said, hey, did you see this? And they posted it on my group. And it was a CNN article with this gentleman. His name was Alex, who's now a friend of my son's. And CNN was doing an interview with a letterboard, and it said, and this is what perked me, it said, keep speaking to us. We are in here. Alex has a message for the world. And he shared this message with everybody and you could see it live. And he said, don't stop talking to us. We're in here. And then at the end, it was like live from Philly or here from Philly. And I was like, what? I was like, wait, somebody else exists in Pennsylvania? Because I've been driving all over the world to go see these people.
Mhm.
And so the next day I called and come to find out that was an S2C practitioner. And so it was a local place to me. They were S2C practitioners. And I said, I know my son's trapped. Like the only thing I can get out of him is I want juice. Like, I mean, we had a $10,000 Dynabox. I should add that my son was considered proficient in all augmentative communication. He could push, I have to go to the bathroom. I have a headache. Although I had a headache became the answer to any pain in his body. It was like, I couldn't have a conversation with him. Didn't matter what icon he could push. He could not tell me he wanted to have a conversation with his sister. That was what I needed in life for him to be able to be okay. And so when I called this guy, I said, can I come in? And I went in literally the next week and my whole world changed in 4 months. He was totally open. My mind was blown.
Right. Now, I know what you mean when you say he was open. Explain that.
Mm-hmm. So RPM right off the bat hits the ground running with like communicating with them, right? So they will use a letterboard and they'll use whatever modality they need to get that kid communicating. They'll rip off pieces of paper and allow them to do choices. S2C will not do that because they don't want to feel like they're influencing the choice. If you only give them 2 choice, S2C is like, well, then they're only picking one of the 2. What if they want to say something different? They need to only use the letterboard. And so when you say open, S2C, and this is one of the biggest differences and probably what really helped me get over that, what I was missing with RPM, S2C gave me a tool that I could take home and generalize. So they have lessons, and in the lessons, you read like a paragraph about a story. Like, let's say one of the ones I read was First in Flight. It was like the Wright brothers. You read a paragraph and then you ask the child like a known question, like, what are we talking about today? And they would say the Wright brothers. And then you go on to explaining things. What year was this? And then they answer. So they're just giving factual content from what you just read. And then when you fast forward and your kid becomes a little more advanced, you start saying, you don't ever say yes, no questions. You start asking, wow, flying around the world, that seems like a pretty intense move, is that something you would ever consider? And you leave it open so that they can then comment what they want, not what they saw, not what they pushed. It was their open communication. And so that's where my son started just, I mean, he was just amazing. The stuff that was coming out of him, I think I cried at every single session, like every session, because the way that they did it was in a way that it taught you like almost the structure of a paragraphed conversation, right? Instead of going in, whereas RPM was like, we know you're in there, let's try and get it out, which was amazing because they could get it out. I just couldn't. And then S2C gave me this format, right? So they gave me this format and it was like, start by just taking that pressure off, take the anxiety off, just let them, they're used to pushing buttons. So let's just retrain their brain to think with their finger and getting their own thoughts out. And then when they're regulated and calm, they call it a communication regulation partner when you're working with them, because the regulation component is key. You know, and those RPM people, all I can tell you, they are the most regulated humans to walk the earth. That's why I'm like, they need nothing but to put a letterboard up in front of people because they're just so regulated and amazing. So it was the open communication is when you are regulated enough and the child understands enough of what you're asking from them to be able to go through those types of conversations and no longer have to answer known questions like factual content. They can answer their opinion. And that's when we started seeing more and more and more of that. And that's when I was like, I have to tell some friends about this because this is insane. And that's when
And how old was he at this point?
I think he was end of his 18th year. Yeah. So he was 18.
Okay. So now he's communicating openly. Okay.
Mhm. And there's one really important thing at the school. They were really big on typing.com. I think this is huge for our community. Huge. It's one of the biggest things I scream from the rooftops. He was doing typing.com at school, and that's where they were just like tracking how, just to get him familiar with the QWERTY keyboard and that he could learn to, communicate instead of writing. His school taught through cursive for a brain body connection, but then they started doing typing.com when he was in high school. And so when I realized what they were doing with S2C, I instantly called the school, and this is where the school was amazing. And I called and said, listen, put that keyboard on a stand. I'm going to buy you a stand. I'm going to buy you an iPad. I'm going to buy you, a keyboard. You're going to put a Bluetooth keyboard on a stand, and I need you to type everything upright because I know that his brain is working faster if you make things upright. And so they did it and they honored it. And if you actually, in the movie Spellers, you see him at his school at one point, nobody's touching him. Nobody is around him. He's working on his academics by himself at his desk, which is a huge, I feel like that needs to be screamed from the rooftops, typing.com. Huge. It's just like it's like busy work, but it's busy work with a purpose. So eventually if they learn to communicate, they're already familiar with the keyboard and then it just clicks and then it just goes right into it. Because when we introduced Vincent to a keyboard,
right,
he ran.
But that's the third step, isn't it? From what I've learned, you start with stencils.
Yep.
You start with the big stencils that only has like 6 letters. Then you work up to the stencil of the full alphabet. Then you work 24. Up to a laminated sheet. Then you work up to typing
on a keyboard.
Typing on a keyboard. Yes.
Yep.
So he had to work up to that point. No.
Oh yeah. He started with the 3 stencils. It's really hard to do too, especially if you've been to like an RPM person and like your kid's in there, you're like, this is so stupid. Why are we doing with 3 letterboards? The kid should be typing. But the way that they do it is like a process you kind of just have to trust. So what's really kind of funny is that, I always feel like I have been a voice for my community, not just my boys, for 20 years. Like that's why I worked in leadership roles with nonprofits, throwing the National Autism Conference and whatnot. I always felt like it was my job to find what works the best for our kids and provide it to everybody in my community. And we got stuck a little with S2C because I was seeing such success at the school with the keyboard. And then his counselors and stuff were using the keyboard and he was starting to communicate with them because now mind you, they're RPM trained, right? So I'm kind of swirling everything together. And when I approached my S2C people, they didn't really have a keyboard protocol. Like back then, it's kind of like gluten-free back when they were diagnosed with autism.
Right.
They just didn't have a keyboard protocol. And I remember being like, he's pretty regulated. He's ready. He wants to do it. He's doing it at school. Can we do it here? And they were like, no, he's not ready yet. Well, it wasn't that he wasn't ready. They just honestly didn't have one. And so I was ruffling a lot of feathers saying, you've got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. Like this is, and Vincent was advocating for himself and he wasn't being listened to. And that's a very painful thing for me to say out loud because I failed him there. He was going in saying, I really want to use my keyboard. It's easier on my body. And they were like, nope, you got to keep doing this. There's a process. He's like, I understand your process. I've done it for 2 years. Like, I'm ready to use a keyboard. And they were like, no, you're not there yet. And so that's what kind of fast forwarded us out to Spellers. So we went out to see Don Marie, JB from the movie, who I had shared this amazing modality with, went and found a practitioner closest to him, which was Don Marie Gavin. And she was a mom of 2 kids with autism who started with RPM and then became an S2C practitioner and was using this for her own children. And she started seeing JB and he was like, honey, go see Don Marie. And if he's ready, she's got that mom side of her. She's not going to hold him back. And so I went out to see her, and this is the craziest story. And this is a true story. They video every session, so it's actually on video. We went out there and she was like, listen, Vince, we're going to start with the laminate. I understand you think you're ready to type, but we're going to start with the laminate because, let's just warm up your body and get familiar with each other. And Vincent's a very sweet, calm, compliant child. And so she's like typing away. About 10 minutes into it, he starts going batshit crazy. Sorry. He starts going crazy. He's like clapping. He's like stimming. And I'm like, okay, something's really wrong. So if that's his way of communicating, something's wrong. And I'm like, oh my gosh, something's really wrong here. And so she was like, she stopped what she was doing. And then now remember, she's a mom. So she stops what she's doing. And she's like, Vince, what's going on? And she held up the board and he said, if I'm going to get anything out of this trip to California, I need to use my keyboard. And I was like, and she was like, okay, but listen, because now remember, there wasn't really like a strong keyboard presence back then. So it was a little newer to her as well. And so she was like, okay, but listen, I don't want you to get your hopes up. If it's really hard to use a keyboard because it's tinier, it's a different feel, it's completely different. And it's QWERTY, not ABC. And so she was like, we'll try it, but if it's not successful, you have to let me go back to the laminate. And he was like, okay. And she put that keyboard up and we've never gone back. I mean, he like flew. She said he was the best keyboarder she'd ever seen and like hit the ground running. And we just figured out so much more about him. And it's just like all worlds combined. But I really believe that typing.com was critical. I mean, it was just automatically in there. So he was like, oh, I type with my finger on a letterboard, on a stencil, like, and then when we had the typing.com and when we paired it together, that's why I feel like he just exploded, and he was so regulated.
Does it speak for him after he types a letter? Does it?
Yeah. It has a voice output. We use Prolocoda text. It's a voice output, we just use the open, communication. He types whatever he wants to say, and then it says everything when he hits enter.
Right. Now what's spelling? That's a third method, no?
So after all of that happened, I think the main issue is that, so Spellers kind of like took the differences into considerations, right? And they were honoring the need for all the replicable program and like the generalization of what they were doing was critical to them. They understood like we need to make this go further. But then they also started focusing on like not just communication, but autonomy, and they wanted to incorporate more motor work, right? So they wanted to help kids on and off the boards. Like they started bringing in visions, and so they were like, well, you can't call that S2C because you're doing something different. And so it kind of forced them to make Spellers. So that's where Spellers modality came to fruition. And it kind of just, out of RPM came S2C because, I don't know if you know the back history, but Elizabeth Fossler used to work with Soma. And then, she was going in a different path, and then she created S2C. And it's kind of a similar thing that happened with the Spellers. And it is rightfully so, though it needs to be its own thing, right? So, I would love to go to I'd go to any RPM tomorrow if they were in my area, and figure out, I really want to figure out how we can take what they do and make more, genies come out of lamps. But I don't know how to do that. And so S2C, what they did was great, amazing as well. And then Spellers has just like like just taken it a whole nother level. Dana Johnson is amazing. I mean, she used to work with Elizabeth Vossler and she was one of the top practitioners, and she is just all about that motor planning component. And she's really honed in on something there.
Okay, because I didn't realize that Spellers was another method.
Uh-huh.
I
So
was
there's
so
RPM,
confused. Mhm.
S2C, and the Spellers modality.
So
Okay.
speaking of Spellers, okay, spelling modality and Spellers, let's talk about the movie. Because I don't know if my viewers have seen the movie.
Yeah,
I
so
brought a whole group of my moms we all went up to go see it. And it's out on YouTube now, and anybody can watch it now. But let's talk about your involvement in that and how that all came about.
yeah, so when all of this was happening, over the years, I'd become really good friends with JB Handley. I would do a lot of TV interviews. A lot of people would call me, ironically, because I have a confirmed reaction for my boys. A lot of like TV things would call me. I've been on CNN, the Today Show, like all these news outlets, right? So he and I kind of became good friends because I was in the parent support and he had an organization called Generation Rescue. And so we knew each other long distance. We're on different coasts. He's Oregon, I'm East Coast. And so when I did one interview and we just became instant, like really good friends, but again, distant. And when all of this started happening, he and I would talk back and forth about our kids, and we realized our kids were like really similar. Vincent and his son Jamie were very, very similar. So when I had this success with Vincent, I finally broke free. I had asked, I started asking all my friends, have any of you guys ever heard of this? And nobody had heard of it. And I'm like, I got to start telling my friends. I got to tell my friends that are going to tell their friends. And we're going to make a ripple in the pond effect because everybody needs to be doing this, right? Presuming intellect, for one, right off the bat, I've been fighting since I'd met Soma. So I call them God taps, not a God wink. Not when I feel like it's a God tap, almost like a push. And so JB kept coming into my head and kept coming into my head. And I'm like, how am I going to call this guy and say, you don't really know your son, you got to do this modality? Because he's done everything. I mean, everything. So I sent him a text and he was at his daughter's game. And I'm like, hey, I got to talk to you. You got a minute? And he was like, what's going on? I'm at a game. And I was like, look at this stuff. Vincent's saying. And he was like, literally, what the hell are you talking about? I mean, he was literally like WTFing me on the phone.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, Vincent's saying all this. I have to tell you about this modality. And I used him as like a teaser to get him to call me, to be like, he's like, this is your son, Vincent. I'm like, this is my son, Vincent. And I'm pretty sure it's your son too. And he was like, I got to call you. So he left the room and he walked outside and he called me and he left his daughter's game and was like, what are you talking about? I'm like, listen, just found a new modality. It's incredible. You can replicate it. You need to do it. And this is so funny. So he went home, he called me, sent me a video of his son. I literally start crying and I'm like, he's going to totally do it. I'm like, he's totally going to do it. He's just like Vincent. He's exactly like my son. He's
And
just
he sent in you a video trying to convince you, like, this will never happen. Look at my son.
Yep. He sent me a video to say, oh my gosh.
Like, you don't understand how bad it is, right?
Yeah. And I'm like, and I sent him a video back of Vincent. And I said, and this is what Vincent looks like when he's not spelling.
Right.
He was like, okay. So he went on a plane and he went to prove me wrong. And instead he proved me right. And he went to prove me wrong, but he realized, oh my gosh, they are in there. And so
wait, where did he go when he got on the plane?
He went to S2C to see Elizabeth Vossler.
Oh,
His parents live in Virginia. So it ironically was like the next town over, or like right next door to him. Mm-hmm. And so he went home to see his parents and he got in to see her. And at that time, like this wasn't really like you could always get an appointment because nobody was really doing it. Nobody really knew about it. Now, oh my gosh, you can't get in to save your life. And it was funny because he was like, oh my gosh, I think we're onto something here. I'm like, keep going, just keep going. And so he wrote a book about his success. And then the book, so many people were like, it's just Jamie and it's just Vincent. It's only the two of them. They're rare. And then he was like, it's not just them. So then he made a movie. So the movie Spellers movie came out to kind of show some more complex kids. And in the movie, there's a little boy, Sid. He is doing RPM. He's an RPMer in the movie. All the other ones I believe were doing S2C or Spellers method. And, it just was a way to show that no matter how motor complex you are or how visually impaired you might be, because Vincent does have some friends with CP and they wear glasses and they can't really see well. So when they type, they have to turn their head and they have to look funky to see the board. It's because they're like impaired, but they're trying to, they're trying to compensate for it. And so they try to capture some more of that in the film instead of just like a really sweet kid like Vincent or Jamie being able to sit there. So they wanted to show dysregulated kids can do this. It was a great film. Oh my gosh, if your viewers have not seen it, I'm so happy you have, but it is probably, I really believe wholeheartedly in 20 years I've been supporting this community, the biggest thing to ever happen to autism was that movie. That movie was incredible. The book goes more into the why.
The book is called
Underestimated.
Right.
Underestimated. So Jamie and JB wrote the book. And then they made the movie to show it's not just them, because that was what we didn't want. We didn't want people to be like, oh, they're like the one person that could do this.
Right, the 1 in a million. Yeah.
Yep. And at the end of in the movie, Elizabeth Bonkers, who was the first ever non-speaking autistic woman to graduate as valedictorian,
Right.
she had like over
I think a lot of people have seen her because she made the
Yeah,
news.
she
The
was on, like,
the
People
picture of her
Mag.
with her hat on and giving the valedictorian speech, but it was
Yep.
all facilitated though.
Yeah.
Right? It was, I mean,
Not
she wasn't
facilitated.
physically speaking, she
Right.
was,
It was
but
typed.
she typed it and it spoke for her.
Correct. She
Right.
did like
Okay,
what
see,
Vincent
I'm
does.
using all the wrong words.
Oh yeah,
Facilitation is something
facilitated
different.
means
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about facilitation because that got a bad rap and I'll tell you that my son David, he's a special ed teacher. He just got his master's in special ed. And when he had to write a paper, I said, why don't you write it on RPM? And he looked into it and he said, no, all of this has been discredited. I can't write on that. Okay. So as I've looked into that a little bit, it was not RPM, it was facilitated communication that got the bad rap. So
let's
let's
touch
talk
on that
about
real
that.
quick, because so the thing about facilitated communication is that there are some kids who cannot completely hold their arm up, right? This modality helps like, kids with CP, and it helps kids with, motor planning issues. And it's really important for people to understand that some people need that crutch. They need a little bit of a lift to the hand and to hold it up for them to talk. But I believe there was one case, it might have been two cases, one case that ended up being really negative and somebody accused somebody of like, I believe it was being sexually inappropriate. You can't quote me. I don't know the exact facts, but I remember it was shot down. I remember like, even for me, like it was shot down. Like I was like, oh, I'm never going to do facilitated communication. Why would I wouldn't want to do that. So that's the one thing that was really big too with S2C and Spellers. Like they were like, you don't touch them ever. Like you don't touch them. Like don't touch them. This is, you hold the keyboard or you hold the letterboard, but they have to do everything by themselves. No holding of the arms. But there are some kids out there that we are finding need that, and that's considered facilitated, right? So you're giving them like a little bit of a support to help encourage them to do it. So, I feel bad for the FC community because I feel like a lot of kids could have been helped. Instead of saying it's all bad, they should have said, okay, this is one or two really bad cases, but let's look at the other like 3,000 it might help. So that was a really sad thing. It really held back our community because everybody just shut it down, like, no, we need speech and drill and ASHA. And, the irony is that my son Vincent was, he was the case study for a 2-hour presentation at ASHA on facilitated communication. I mean, on augmentative communication success.
Let's tell people what ASHA is.
It's the American Speech and Hearing Association. So they are the speech pathologists of the world and the ones that hate facilitated communication, and they do not like RPM. But Elizabeth Bossler was a speech pathologist that once she saw it, she got it. And in the movie, I say, once you see it, you can't unsee it. I mean, she saw it. It made sense to her. She was smart enough to say, oh, wow, there's something here. I think we didn't really understand this.
Right.
And so that's why.
But what I'm getting is that this is the conflict here, is the speech pathology people hate this, and they are really standing in the way of this getting into schools because they
absolutely.
are right. Right.
Absolutely. And the tide's going to shift though. I mean, there are so many, we were on a program, it was called the High Wire, And once they caught wind of this whole Spellers modality, they flew all of the cast out, and we all flew out to Texas, and we went to Austin, and we were on the set, and it got 14 million views in a week. They aired Spellers,
Wow.
14 million views. The highest rating they'd ever had was 6 million with Michael Jordan's The Dance. And I mean, 14 million. You find something that's going to help a kid with autism, and you tell them that your kid can communicate if you invest a
Mhm.
couple of years teaching their body how to do it with their hands instead of their mouth because of their
Mhm.
apraxia, it's going to hit the ground running. I mean, the movement is just exploded. That book, that movie, it's a beautiful thing. So speech pathologists are either going to have to come alongside, or they're going to be like run over. Yeah.
Mhm.
So Vince was a case study because he used the augmentative communication. He had a $10,000 Dynabox that was like specifically programmed to him, and he could say, answer his questions and say, I need to use the restroom, and this is my mommy, and this is my dog. And, it was all like fluff, like fourth grade, third grade mentality stuff. It was awful. And he was the case study for a 2-hour presentation with a speech pathologist named Dick Linton and our BCBA Heidi Kepler, who was head of the Pennsylvania, like she was involved with the Pennsylvania Verbal Behavior Project.
Mhm. Right. And they thought it was so great.
Yeah. I mean, and both of them now are like, oh my gosh, Vincent, this is amazing. Like my behavior specialist, there are sometimes now behavior specialists are equally as like, no, that doesn't work. We got to do ABA. But when all you have to do is meet somebody, and you have to have a good heart and an open mind, and you have to be smart enough to understand there's no voodoo in this. I mean, my BCBA was like, I don't know, honey, I read the book. I'm not really thinking this is accurate. I said, just come have a conversation with Vincent. She came over to my house. She literally will never be the same since. I mean, she's come to my house saying, can I do a quick interview for LinkedIn? And, she's just been amazing. She is his biggest cheerleader now. You cannot unsee it. He literally was talking to her about things I didn't know when they were little. And he was like, I knew you always meant good for me. I never got frustrated. I knew that you always loved me and cared, and you were doing your best. And then when she was getting ready to leave, he started throwing a fit. And now being a behavior specialist, she goes, oh my gosh, he's so upset. I wore him out. This is too emotional. I'm sorry. And I said, well, let's ask him why he's throwing a fit. And I put the board up, and I was like, Vince, what's wrong? And he said, I have so much more to say.
Oh.
He goes, I have so much more to say. And then he
Hmm.
was like, I love you, Heidi. And she goes, I'll come back. And she did. And she does.
Wow.
So, I mean, it will change. I have challenged any professional to come have a conversation with my son. Just come have a conversation. You will never not believe it. Never.
Right.
It's just so powerful.
Right. Yeah, you're not doing anything. I mean, you can see when you watch the kids, they're doing it completely by
Oh, yeah.
themselves.
Oh yeah.
You
Yep.
know.
Yep.
So I
It's
just,
powerful.
yeah, it's kind of crazy. So, what is the organization that you have now? It's something med maps. What is that?
Yeah, so it's the Medical Academy of Pediatrics and Special Needs. So what I realized when my kids were injured, and I am really blessed to have those doctors in my corner, because I feel like they go hand in hand, right? Spellers is amazing, but your body needs to be healthy and organized, and like as healthy and to its highest potential as it can be, right? And so when my kid fell and that OT told me about it, I went to something called the Dan doctor. It was like Defeat Autism Now. And she taught me how to just treat root cause medicine. And so that doctor kind of educated me to say, okay, we have to find what the issues are and let's fix them. So the theory was, if your child's sitting on a tack, take it out, and they're going to be less like agitated and stimmy and, in pain. And then if your child's sitting on 2 tacks, take out 1 tacks. And like the more tacks they have, you just got to start removing them and fixing them and repairing them. And so it wasn't that I never accepted my child, because that's usually the contrary most people think. It was more that I knew there was something really off. And I also remember I come from the place of I knew that there was something that injured them. So I was always on a mission to make their body just as healthy as it could possibly be. So 20 years I did the parent support roles. On my very last day of the National Autism Conference, the doctors that would speak for us were from the Medical Academy of Pediatrics and Special Needs. These were my heroes. These were the people that saved my kid. We can get into that if you have time, but if not, we'll do another one. But my one son had life-threatening seizures. Nobody could figure it out. Every neurologist, nobody could find the cause. My MAPS doctor found the cause. So these people were truly my heroes in this community. And they had asked me if I would come alongside and become the executive director for their organization, because they recognized that they needed thousands of them. And so I knew they needed thousands of them because I would hold these conferences and parents would be like, where's the MAPS doctor? And I'd be like, oh, good luck. I drive to Chicago. It took me 3 years to get in with her. Like, there's just not enough. There's not enough. There's not enough looking at the root cause. And these doctors are so incredible and open-minded, and they're all volunteers. None of them get paid. They're just like the St. Jude's of like hospitals and they're of conferences. They're just like the sweetest, amazing humans. And they literally heard about Spellers, and every one of the board members was like, we have to do a plenary on this. We have to teach every doctor and every healthcare practitioner that
Wow.
these kids are in there. And so I am so honored. It was like my two worlds completely collided because our last MAPS conference was this past spring in Charlotte, and it was our first ever sold out conference on the neurobiology of speech and communication. And my son was up there speaking.
Wow.
It was amazing, amazing. And he talked about how critical it was for him to do the biomedical and have his body organized enough so that when he was presented with spelling, he could just run. It was the one thing I couldn't turn on with him. The one thing I couldn't get was his language. I don't care how it comes out. I got it.
Right. What kind now are these naturopathic doctors or?
No, our president is Dr. James Neuenschwander. He is an ER, he was an ER physician. He's an internist. He was doing a lot of like cancer, and he was helping a lot of parents that were like really sick. And then they'd be like, can you help my kids? And then his wife, who's a nurse, was like, you got to go to a DAN conference. And he was like, what's a DAN conference? And so he went and was like, oh my gosh, they don't teach us any of this, like root
Right.
cause medicine. What is this?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Doctors don't get the root cause, they just medicate.
Yeah. Yep. And my dad, he just went on the high wire yesterday, and he goes, never have I met a child who's deficient in Prozac. Like, I mean, if you have like anxiety, if it's so true, he goes, I mean, it's so funny when he does it. He always uses something different, but it's true. Like they're not they're deficient in something. So let's figure it out. You know, maybe
Right.
it's they need 5-hydroxytryptophan or, you know, L-theanine, and, you know, we have to like help the serotonin levels, but we don't have to drug everybody. And I mean, it's really sad because a lot of our kids at like 8 years old or 5 years old are being prescribed like Prozac. Like they're not Prozac deficient. They have something going on. So let's figure out
Right.
what, let's try and remove a tax so that it can like decrease that stress.
Right.
So
Right.
these
Right.
doctors are like my heroes. But no, we have 5 people on our board. 2 of them, Dr. Liz Mumper and Dr. Nancy O'Hara, are pediatricians. One of them, Dr. Gaetanis, he was chief of neurology at Tufts University. He's now at Brown. Amazing human. He is so amazed by the Spellers movement. He is such a proponent. And then the other 2 are Dr. Usman Singh and Dr. Neuenschwander, who are both general practitioners, you know, internists. They were both, Dr. Usman is my doctor. Usman Singh, she worked at Cook County Hospital, and she was in ER trauma. Like, I mean, you know, they get into it usually because somebody either shakes them and wakes them up, but she herself got into it. And this is why I knew she needed to be my doctor, because she had a daughter who had a reaction and ended up dying of a peanut allergy as a result. Like
Oh,
she,
wow.
it tripped up a peanut allergy, and then
Wow.
down the road, it's a very sad
I was
story.
gonna say it had to have affected her personally to.
It did. She like basically was like, I'm so done with mainstream medicine telling me like you're being exaggerative of your kid's peanut allergy. And
Yeah.
then she passed away. And
Yeah.
then she was like, and then even like her, you know, people were like, we're so sorry. And she's like, nobody gets it. So she left to open up an amazing center. And she took me 3 years to get into her, but I knew I needed her heart. And
So she's the one that found the root cause of the seizures?
yeah. Yeah.
So what did she find?
So my one son had a concussion at school. Both of my kids, what we realized when they had their reaction to their inoculations was that they had an underlying mitochondria dysfunction, right? So too many, too soon. And the adjectives that like come along for the ride were what they were reacting to. They couldn't process it. And so when we got them, you know, kind of in a place that they were like stable. My one son, Victor, was going to school. He was like in 4th grade before we'd switched him back to private. And he had gotten really bad concussion at school. He'd like hit his head up against the wall. And unbeknownst to me, like 2 days later, he started having these horrible grand mal seizures where he would like desat and like to the 40s. Like it was really severe. And we didn't know where it came from, what happened. They ended up sending us to the hospital so many times. I mean, he coded in the hospital, like they would push the button, they were IV and dripping him with seizure meds, anti-epileptic drugs. And, I went to, at this point, I was doing conferences for, parents and practitioners for learning about autism and working alongside some of these MAPS doctors, not for them, but working with them. So, I had been doing all of these conferences and they were incredible. And I would bring in like the local doctors would come, like, so like our chief of neurology from our local hospital would come. So they all became like friends with me. And when Victor was having these seizures, they were like, we're here to help. They pulled in all the infectious disease, all the immunologists, their gold team specialists to try and figure out what was going on. They could not find the results of like what was the trigger. And they were like, good luck, God bless. Sometimes kids die from seizures. And then they gave me a Make-A-Wish trip. And then my doctor, who lost her child, would not stop looking and digging and like literally was like, I think this is related to his mitochondria disorder. And I'm like, how could that even be? Like, that's like your cellular energy. How could a seizure be related to this? And she goes, I really think this might be a cerebral folate deficiency. And I'm like, I'll get a test. So I did a test and it came back negative. So then she was like, I think you need to check it out because I think he still has it. And I'm like, the test is negative. So I called the researcher who developed the test and he said, it's like a pregnancy test, honey. If it's negative, it might not be detecting it. If it's positive, it's positive, but it might not be detecting it. I'm like, what could make it be negative? And he was like, well, are you dairy free? And I was like, of course. And he was like, well, then that might be it. It might not be strong enough to detect on our test. And I go, oh, should I give my kid dairy? And he goes, oh my God, no. This is so scary. He goes, don't give your kid dairy. Dairy makes your brain produce antibodies that attack itself. And if you have a CFD, that's what they're thinking the seizure is, right? So little did I know, dairy was like a poison for us. So I was like, well, then how do I find out? And I called Dr. Usman and I'm like, well, how do I find out? And she goes, you got to get a spinal tap. So I went to my doctors in Philly and I said, I need to go to the top mitoneurologist in the country. His name is Dr. Schaffner. He's in Atlanta, Children's South of Atlanta. I put my kids in the Suburban, drove them down there. We did a spinal tap and muscle biopsy, and I'll be damned, she was right. They had a cerebral folate deficiency. They put my son on leucovorin, the proper dose, which is just folinic acid. I was already on it, but I wasn't on the proper dose. If you have a cerebral folate deficiency, it's like what they give people that have chemo. It strips your folinic acid out of your body. They put him on the proper dose and told me to keep him strict dairy free. He has not had a seizure in 13 years.
Wow.
13 years. I mean, and now let me tell you, I went back to my doctor locally and I'm like, look what we found. And then he was like, oh my gosh, like, okay, we'll change the diagnosis to seizures induced by cerebral folate deficiency. Crazy. So if you don't know why I took the role and want to make 1 million of these doctors, they believe in our spellers. They want to heal our kids and they want to get to the root cause. These people are absolutely my superheroes. 100%.
Right. So what do you do as an organization? I think you just had a conference or something.
Yeah, we just had one. We have 2 conferences a year and we train all healthcare professionals. It's no parents, it's just healthcare professionals. We're a CME organization. Anybody that walks in the door has to take foundations, and the foundations track is actually a track where you come in as a healthcare practitioner and you're going to be able to recognize, like they mention, a cerebral folate deficiency. Like, it's critical that every doctor that ever sees a special needs child needs to know about that. The chief of neurology in my local town did not know about that. Like, it's something I'm so passionate about. Our foundations course is basically everything you need to know to be able to recognize if a kid walks through the door. Doesn't mean you have to know how to treat it, but you sure as hell should know how to recognize it so you can get them to the proper care. And then when they go through the foundations, then we have like a plenary. So like the plenary was on the neurobiology of speech and communication. Anything that's pressing in our community is what they typically will make a plenary. So the one we're going to have in the fall, we're going to be in Arizona this fall, and it's actually going to be on the gut. And because a lot of our kids are having a lot of gut issues. So if anything that I know this is going to sound really, I bringing this up to you about the seizures. So anything that we are seeing, or the MAPS community, I'm not a doctor, I'm just a parent, but anything that our MAPS community is seeing that is really needing all hands on deck, best reachers, best top people, they make a plenary out of it. And that's what they focus on. And so we're going to be doing the neurology because a lot of our adults are passing away from seizures and we need we need more people to know about the hows, the whys, what we can do, how we can help.
Yeah.
So that's what our spring plenary is going to be. So we're doing this fall is going to be on the gut, hugely impactful because your gut's your second brain. And we have to talk about things like the cerebral folate issue and the dairy. Like even something so simple as dairy could have taken my kid's life. Like it's just crazy. I was told to treat it like a life-threatening peanut allergy. And I'm like, how many people knew that? How many
Right.
people, like if I didn't have my MAPS doctor, who would have known that? Nobody knew that.
Right.
So this one's
Yeah,
gonna
and
be
you know, Robbie used to get violently ill. Every weekend he had diarrhea, and it seemed every holiday he would vomit like every half hour all night long till nothing was coming out but green stomach bile. And it was just chronic. And I would call the doctors and they say, oh, he has a stomach virus. I'm like, you don't get a stomach virus every 6 weeks. Like I just couldn't get an answer from anybody. I took him to the GI doc, you know, at the UMDNJ, at their autism center, and said, nobody had an answer for me. Nobody. It's just, I just came up, you know, with dead ends all the time. So it was very frustrating. And obviously, you know, he ended up passing from the seizure. So to hear that you're getting somewhere and you're getting some answers is, you know, huge for me. So
Oh, you have no idea. I'm fighting for Robbie's.
Yeah.
I'm fighting for Robbie's. And I know I share, like my one son is very medically complex. He was the one that had the exposed nerve vibe. Like he's very, very complex. He's like whack-a-mole. I'm always figuring it out, but I'm telling you what, I'm always like, my only hope is my MAPS doctor. And that is so scary. And it's not really fair to our community. Every doctor should be trained in all of this. Every doctor should know how to look for these things.
And they should be looking deeper.
That cerebral folate deficiency, it's like $150 test. I mean, it's like
Right.
$150 test. Like, I'm like, anybody who has autism should be like, there's so much literature out there on it. I mean, you can Google cerebral folate deficiency, Dr. Fry, Frye. He's one of our MAPS doctors. He's amazing. Dr. Rosenmil. Like they have so much literature about like, you should be dairy free, no mammal milk. Like, I mean, it talks about like, if you have this, your brain makes antibodies that attack itself. It can look like,
Right.
you know, pain, irritability, whatever. Like, and the same with the gut, like hearing you say that, like my kid was pooping sandpaper and they were like, oh, that's just typical. He has autism. I'm like, how the hell is autism related? Like, wait, isn't that a neurological disorder? And then,
Yeah.
oh, wait, what? Like, how is this related? It just is so infuriating. I mean, it's why I'm so passionate about MAPS and they're just such good people. It's like, that's why like they just made me, I just loved them even more when Spellers came out and they're like, oh, we need to educate every doctor about this. I'm like, really? This? Oh my gosh, really? You guys love that? Oh,
Yay.
I know, it's crazy. So yeah. I
Oh,
feel like I
well,
just told you like 40 different things on this interview, so I'm sorry.
I know, but that's okay. That's okay. And I learned a lot. And thank you. Thank you for coming on and you know, anything I can do to support what you're doing, because obviously you hit my nerve
Yeah,
with
that's
that
the
at
one.
the end. So
Yeah, and I have to just say I'm so sorry. There were like 3 spellers we recently lost. 3 spellers we recently lost, and they all were lost to seizures. And you know, I know that they were all eating dairy. I know, like I have yet to find one that I'm like, and I can't help but think like,
Yeah.
could it have
well,
been
Friday's pizza day, and that's the day that Robbie would always get sick. You know, so I started figuring that one out. You know, it's got to be, it must have something to do with that. It has to be a gluten dairy thing or something. You know, but
Let's see why, like but it needs to be screamed from the rooftops. Like
Yeah.
everybody needs to know about this. Everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah.
So yeah, send any healthcare practitioners, nurses, anybody who Dr. New always says, if you have a degree on your wall and it has to do with healthcare, you need to be at a MAPS conference.
Nurses too.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, we have a ton of nurses. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nurses, health coaches. We have health coaches, nurses. We have a lot of OTs that come. Now
Yeah.
remember, that makes me so happy because an OT is what led me down the path.
Right.
So we, you know, like they are sometimes the first line of defense to be like, great, I'm doing your early intervention. OT, speech, anybody. We want, you know, anybody who is invested in this community. You know, it's a CME organization. So obviously we only give credit to like, you know, we give certain credits. Speech pathologists come and they can get credit for some back way. But yeah, I mean, anybody can come, anybody. And we're even doing like students. We give student scholarships. we just want this out there. We just
Yeah.
need to make sure we save the next ones. We have to stop the tragedies.
Yeah.
I mean, for your son, for my doctor's son,
Mhm.
I mean, she saved mine, but we're not all that lucky. And
Right.
who knows, whack-a-mole, I'm so scared she leaves me. What
Right.
am I going to deal with next?
And every time that, I meet new parents, because I have retreats for moms and I bring in speakers and everything like that. But as soon as they hear about Robbie right away, that's their biggest fear. They're like, I'm so afraid that that's going to happen to my son. So I'm happy to get this out there to them. I'm like, hey, watch this and see, maybe I can do another interview with some more, you can set me up with some more interviews. So
Yeah, absolutely.
we can
Anything
talk
I can
about some
do.
more.
Yeah. Let's save them all.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing the interview with me today. We've learned a lot, and I think my parents are going to learn a lot from you as well. So thanks for taking the time out to be here today.
I really, really appreciate you letting me speak.
Thank you for joining us today. Be sure to join us again on our next episode of Spectrum Perspectives.